It took Amnesty International nearly 2 years to condemn suicide bombing, and people were just silent. So I thought that was very problematic, and I think the whole image of Israel and of Israelis, and I think of Jewish people in the media in relation to the Intifada, I found very disturbing and problematic.
Yeah. There's racism all over the world. There's racism against all kinds of races and ethnicities. Why is anti-Semitism so insidious?
So, first of all, I would say as a footnote to this, I don't see racism as something that's disappearing. I think that, on the one hand, I think blatant forms of racism and blatant pronouncements of racist thinking may not be acceptable in some circles. But if you look at economic, political marginalization,
we're in your field.
Physical segregation in cities, I think I would argue that no, that it's
alive and well.
It's alive and well.
In other words, the dump sites, the waste sites, are always in your black neighborhoods, not in your white neighborhoods. This kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think if you look at issues of globalization, that there's a tremendous increase in marginalization throughout the world. At the one hand, there's almost like a hybrid culture that's coming together, that people in different parts of the world are able to communicate, to do business and commerce, to the work that we're doing through internet and email and communication. There's a tremendous coming together of people from all parts of the world, perhaps as never before in the history of humanity. But at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of marginalization, that people on the receiving end of globalization are becoming increasingly disconnected from institutions of power, political power, state power, and that sort of thing. And I think it's within this vacuum that some of the most pernicious forms of fascistic, if you want to say, or Islamofascism, if you want to say, that there's movements that are emerging that are tapping into this group of marginalized and dispossessed people, and they're reinventing a form of an essentialized identity and a very narrow identity that doesn't accept notions of otherness and doesn't accept the others in their midst. And I think this is part of the globalizing process, and this is the area that I'm studying.
Wow! So you're saying that the Islamic people are missing the globalization boat?
I would argue that globalization has a positive side and a negative side, and they're equally the same. They're the same outcomes of the same process. They're different outcomes of the same process.
Okay, but you're saying that to a large extent, people in Arabic countries might feel not on the receiving end of globalism. They're feeling raped and exploited.
And I think they're in a sense they're being disconnected from the positive side of globalization. And I think, given the history of Europe, and especially in the interwar period, this is my thesis or my argument, where you have tremendous levels of displacement and economic and social problems. That this was the environment that was rife for the Nazi movement and fascist and extreme nationalists to pick up and move forward.
So here, a guy like Adolf Hitler came. Germany was humiliated after the First World War. He picked up on those feelings and elevated the people and said, come with me. Yeah. We're going to make you great. We're going to make Germany great again.
Yeah. And these were people that were truly dispossessed and they had really had problems. And the thing that we learned, I think, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the Second World War was through international regulations of human rights and international codes, that we were supposed to learn something about this and move forward. And I think, unfortunately, that's not the case now. And I would argue that, on the one hand, the dispossession of people in some countries is immoral and unethical, but on the other hand, their reaction to it is equally unethical. And that even if you're oppressed, there has to be an ethical response to your conditions. And to become intolerant and extreme and reinventing your culture or repackaging your culture in an ugly way or an immoral way is not the answer.
So the Osama bin Ladens of the world, the Adolf Hitlers of the world, come and they find this ripe environment and they see opportunity.
Definitely. And what I find troubling, and this is the work that I'm doing, is the sort of the relationship between those type of extreme Islamo-fascist, I'll call them, movements. And I think it's very important to realize there's 1 billion Muslims in the world. There's tremendous diversity. There's cultural influences that are extremely different schools of thought. There's Sufis that are very open and spiritual and that sort of thing. So I don't want to label Muslims as one group, but I think that within many Islamic societies, there's a small group, if not a significant group of people that are adhering to this non-tolerant form or fascistic form of their identities. And this is what I'm concerned about, but I'm also concerned about the intellectual and liberal reaction, particularly in Europe, to this extreme Islam. That the liberals have remained silent, and I would argue through their paternalistic and racist view of Islam in the Middle East, that they don't expect anything better from those people in a way, and they're not condemning their behavior in the Middle East or on the streets of Paris when they attack Jewish people.
Now you mentioned Europe, and I'd like to touch upon a very interesting polling study that was conducted by the ADL, and there was a very fascinating find from that. Please talk about that.
So the ADL did a survey, I believe it was last April 2004, where they polled 5,000 people through telephone interviews and surveys in 10 different European countries, and they measured the levels of anti-Semitism. And what a colleague and I are in the process of doing is looking at that analysis and looking at how views of Israel and notions of anti-Israel or anti-Zionism influences the survey.
Okay.
So what we found is the level of anti-Israel sentiment in 10 European countries is surprisingly low. Given all surprisingly low, especially given all the rhetoric at universities and in the media, particularly in the elite media, it's not very high. A small group expressed anti-Israel feelings.
That's interesting because I was talking with Bat Yor, and she said the same thing. She said that really your run-of-the-mill common European is a fun-loving person that is not anti-Semitic,
right,
and that it's kind of trickling down from the top.
Right. So so I think the ADL material confirms what she was saying.
Huh. I know this is a really involved study, but if you could kind of just, for our listening audience, tell us a little bit about some of the questions that they would ask.
So I think some of the issues to measure anti-Israel feelings were dealing with to what level do people feel Israel is responsible for the violence. There was a question dealing with whether people link Israel and apartheid. There's sort of the connection there. Whether the IDF was intentionally hurting or shooting civilians, Palestinian civilians, and whether suicide bombings could be justified.
Okay.
And that was sort of the basis of our
kind of a temperature reading.
Yeah.
You were one of the activists against the apartheid in South Africa. So you would know what an apartheid is. Why is Israel not an apartheid?
I would argue that the most diverse society in the history of humanity is contemporary Israel. That on the one hand, you have Israeli Palestinians, citizens living and working and prospering in Israel. They're represented in the Knesset. You have secular Palestinian organizations and religious organizations, Christians and Muslims. The indigenous people to the region are in part certainly Jewish people who've been there since the beginning of time. If you read history books, the Quran, the New Testament, the presence of Jewish people is documented throughout this period. So you have the indigenous Jewish people who live there, and then you have the migration of Jewish people from the Middle East, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Egypt, and beyond in Iraq, and what is now Pakistan and India, from North Africa, from the Americas, from Europe. And you have all of these people from Ethiopia, Sudan, all of these people living together and creating an amazing human experiment that's dynamic and creative and filled also with some problems and contradictions, but an exciting, incredible place. And to say that Israel is a racist apartheid state, or it's to me, it's unbelievable.
What about a colonist country?